My name's Jeff. Welcome to Versus Live.
Why write poetry?
Poem is done. Like, what was the point here? I also don't know where this poem is going.
Poetry's very love-hate.
The worst possible thing is them just saying no.
What's up, everybody?
Hello.
Hey. So I was talking with Matthias.
This is Jeff, by the way.
And this is Matthias. And he mentioned an actress. Guys, I have no pop culture knowledge, to be honest. So you named someone whose name was... I thought her last name was very interesting.
What, Dominic Fishback?
Yes, Fishback.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone else by that last name.
Really? You've never met the Fishbacks?
I've never met the Fishbacks.
You've never met the Fishbacks of
the
Welshman
Fishbacks?
Fishbacks?
They have evaded me.
What's going on with you?
But I'm so happy you've introduced me to her, and you said that they're...
Yeah. So
who is she first?
Okay, so here's the thing. Jeff has very little. He does not really stay tapped in when it comes to like the pop culture stuff. But if you're out there in the YouTube universe, you've probably, maybe at this time, you've watched the show Swarm. It's on Amazon. I think it's directed by Donald Glover. And so in this show, actually, I'm not going to give away anything about the show because it doesn't even matter. But the main character, the actress that plays the main character, Dominic Fishback, and first of all, if you have not seen it yet, I definitely recommend it. If you are a insert this artist's names fan, I'm not going to say the name of the artist because I feel like whenever you say the name of the artist, the artist's fans like are invoked, which is actually interestingly enough.
We're just trying not to get hurt tonight.
It's interestingly enough, that's what this show is about, but that's neither here nor there. So, but yeah, so the main character is played by Dominic Fishback, and first of all, great, incredible performance. Actually, I mean, really everybody in the show, really had some really incredible performances, but a little bit of research into Dominic Fishback and her history. And it was actually really, really cool to see she has some origins in poetry. She's written poems before. And, here's the thing, because I think that like poetry as a medium is kind of, it's really accessible in that, you don't really need much to do it or kind of get into it. And I think a lot of people that like a lot of creatives, like if you're especially like when it comes to like performers, right? Like a lot of times, their entry, or at least one of the pathways they kind of take into performance, whether it being like movies or acting or anything like that. A lot of times, they've done poems, and they've either written poems or, performed poems. Apparently she has like a one-woman play, which is really, really cool. So yeah, I don't know. I think watching that, I didn't know a lot about the actress kind of coming in. I had seen her in a couple things and always thought she, did a really, really great job. But this was the first time I, ever kind of got prompted to kind of like tap in and be like, oh wow, like I didn't know like you did poems before. That's pretty cool.
Did you actually get a chance to see what she was doing? Or hear her?
No. I mean, she has a couple poems like that were posted. I didn't see any actual performances. But I took a look at a couple poems that she like that I was able to kind of access. She might have some video and stuff like that posted somewhere. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a podcast for another day.
Yeah, must be just the platform that gives you. If you make your name in whatever field you're in, but then you also have your personal page, especially like if you're like an actor and actress, your name's out there. So people are already kind of searching you. And then you could be like, oh, by the way, I did this. And what a great platform.
Yeah, because it's like you also have this, I think a lot of times we're kind of laser focused on this one thing that we're trying to do, like, and especially when it comes to like, well, not especially, but I think myself included, when it came to poetry, it's like poetry is the thing that I'm doing, so I'm like I can't do other things, and I'm like, man, like the things that you're doing poetry wise, especially if you're fairly good at it, they're transferable skills, and especially when we're talking about memorization
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
just a kind of the
Mm-hmm.
performance quality and kind of being able to pull those emotions and things like that out. A lot of those things, like if you're a good poet and people really resonate with your work, and resonate with your performance, then typically there's something in there that can be transferred over to somebody who's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I want you to, read the script the way that this character might read the script. And because you probably are certain characters and things like that in your work. You'd probably transition over that kind of domain as far as like being different people
Mm-hmm.
in your work.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
I mean, I think I was at the watering hole pre end of the world, and
And this is not a literal watering hole. This is,
but
although
it
he was
was the
there
literal
too.
ending of the world, to be clear.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And one of the people there, I mean, he made a job out of poetry, but not in the sense of like he goes around, touring and things like that.
Yeah.
No, it was he made a curriculum for schools based around poetry. So he goes around, he talks to principals, he talks to like superintendents and people like that, and says, "Hey, look, this is a curriculum I have that you can implement in your
Yeah.
school." Like if you're really serious about your work, you find ways of incorporating your work into your work.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that way, and I mean, aside from just the obvious benefit of being able to feed yourself, being able to make money and things like that along the way in your creative process, it also helps you to really kind of dig into other ways that your work or the things that you're doing can really be effective and impactful. Because just like, I mean, you're the friend that you had mentioned here before, it's just this idea that writing my poems and then performing my poems, that's not the only way that the work that I do with poems can be impactful, and that it can be impactful in a way that's really affecting the youth and being able to teach the youth. I mean, that's an angle that a lot of people wouldn't really explore, but it's definitely an angle to explore with your work. And you should, I mean, I would always advocate to explore every angle. I was it was so funny when it comes to like the photography stuff. I remember being like, okay, like this is one way that I know how to do like, photography. And then that way, like, do like portraits or whatever the situation is. And then I actually talked to somebody not that long ago, probably like a little bit less than a month ago. And they said that one of the things that they did is they would go around in their city and take pictures of, just like either like little frequently used spots and places and stuff like that, or like he would go over to like even like banks and stuff like that. He would just like take pictures of, like establishments, and he would like sell them on like there's like websites you can just like kind of sell like almost like stock images and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, like that. And he's like, it's not like a huge amount that he's like getting from. He actually worked with them. It's not a huge amount that he's getting, but it that doing that pushed him into another career where he now does like he takes photos of like national parks. So like but like they'll book him, they'll fly him out, and he'll like do the photography for these national parks. And but like it started from doing that, which is like a really cool thing to happen.
Yeah. And even those little things, even if it's never your main thing, it's still side. It never goes away.
Yeah.
You can build on it. And it's just something like, okay, I got my groceries this month. You know what I mean? Or this week or whatever. Or I got a meal.
Yeah.
That's one less meal that you
got a meal.
You have to pay for, So I think, and there's all kinds of avenues. Like you could, I think you see a lot of bigger name poets working in like marketing and advertising. So you're writing copy. Because in general, if you're writing poetry, you ideally have a knack for words. So I think those are fields you lean into a lot. For instance,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say like like in Columbus, like Ruth Watt. I mean, that's what she does. She, at least in the past, she was working with like advertiser or marketing or something like that. And that's a very common thing.
Yeah, because I mean, just kind of what you were saying. I think people are looking for, like companies. A lot of times they're looking for people that are not just good with words, but they're unique. Like unique messaging. So a lot of times they're like, man, I can't really put my finger on what this messaging should be, and then a poet's able to come up with something just because their brain maybe processes, you know, the words a little bit differently.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
into it, y'all. Look
It's
into it.
no excuses. Yeah. Okay. But again, her name is Dominique Fish.
Dominic
That's
Fishback.
okay. Do you think she's something that people should be? I mean, besides like performance-wise, in terms of poetry, do you feel like it's someone that people should be keeping an eye out on, or just kind of something to
Yeah,
act as like inspiration for people?
yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. Like, I think that I think she's good. That's first of all, but I think it's also like I'm always really excited and and I'm eager to follow people that are really expanding outside of the the entry realm that you would like of like just their skill of being like, okay, like this is what I'm doing here, but I'm doing these things in these other spaces that kind of are, you can see the contributions of my like, and maybe poetry isn't even her core artistic form,
Mhm.
or we kind of what she does that kind of gives her life, maybe, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So it's kind of hard to tell. I'm not like a devotee, I would say,
Mhm.
maybe yet. But it's just, I mean, it's just one of those things that, you find out and you're like, man, this is like a really cool, but it's just to say that, like, I think regardless of what you think about her poetry, which again, I think that you would be impressed. I think outside of that, it's still, kind of looking at the entire scope of who she is as an artist.
Mhm.
I think that's something to look at, because I think if you were to watch this show and you were to be like, okay, she's a really good actress,
Mhm.
maybe, acting is the only thing that she's doing around here, but I'm like, oh, wait a minute, like, yeah, she's doing other things. And I think that's, and I think this, thing that's interesting. I think a lot of times poets, they kind of fall back on, if somebody's doing something really accelerated and they're like, man, this is like a really, really like kind of acceleration of their craft. They kind of, they don't, not gonna say beat themselves up, and not even necessarily compare themselves, but they don't think that they can, because they're like, well, I only do poems, and so it's like,
Mhm.
I, she can do all those things, but I
Mhm.
only do poems, and I'm like,
Mhm.
well, hold on, like, let's. And I get that, as if that's all you want to do, like that's fine, but like that's not that, don't use that as an excuse to not do other things.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Mhm.
I would say look into her. If
Mhm.
you're a fan, be a fan.
Mhm. Mhm. I think kind of shifting this to discussion I kind of wanted to focus on a little bit
Yeah.
today in terms of developing your craft and stuff. And one thing that you mentioned earlier too is that if you're you know a good poet and you're trying to focus on your performance and things like that, I think something that a lot of even very accomplished poets do, like, I don't know if you ever see like a reading of like a big name poet, and like you see them like on YouTube or whatever giving a reading, and you're like, that was okay. Like it's not like I like them. I enjoy their work, but hearing them read their work isn't necessarily something that I'm deriving like the greatest enjoyment from their performance of the work. Has that ever happened to you?
Huh. I think I can resonate with the feeling. I don't know if I can say that that specific instance has happened to me, but I think that it might just be because a lot of the people that I'm a big fan of, like, one of the first things I did was kind of look them up and like look up like them reading poems. And so the thing
Mm,
that they did when they read their poems at whatever venue was probably like similar, and I just maybe accepted it. But I think I can definitely resonate with that for sure.
mhm. For instance, I'm gonna show you a poem. This is
Show it.
it's another we're not doing Twitter poems again, but I found a poem on Twitter.
We're not doing Twitter poems, but this is the poem from
It's a
an
poem I
app
found on
that's
Twitter.
popular.
So good. I'm viewing it as like, hey, if you're publishing on Twitter, this is a public space, so we are looking at you. Yeah, I mean, we're looking at you. Um, I want you. How would you read like the first
Yammy
four?
Yamsboro. Okay, fair enough.
Necker with two ends, man.
Gotcha.
Um,
So go ahead.
I want do me. Can you read for me just down to perceives?
Uh, Wait, down to perceives?
Yeah, it's like my eyes can see to what my mind
Oh,
perceives.
okay, gotcha.
Just down to there. Just read for me how.
I'm having a hard time in my mind. In the mirror, the real me is hard to find. Distorted, contorted, illusionary, symmetry. I must reject this deceptive imagery. My eyes concede to what my mind perceives.
Okay. So, like, do you feel like that's how you normally read poems?
Is that how I normally read poems?
Yeah.
No.
I would say no.
I would say no, but it's like I don't. I guess I don't write poems like that. So
For sure. It's not your poem, not your poem, not your voice. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you, I'm gonna do this
Okay.
again, and like, imagine somehow you did write this poem.
Done.
Yeah.
Okay.
How would you read it?
If I wrote the poem?
Yeah. Imagine that you wrote this. Obviously, very different style, but
wait, like the same words?
Same words. Does anything change or nothing change? You think that was the best?
You know, I'm having a hard time in my mind, in the mirror. Like the real me is hard to find.
I'm gonna stop you right there. So I'm already immediately very different, though, right? Immediately very different.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like I felt like the first way you read it is the way you go to an open mic. Very common rhythm, very common style of how people read poems.
Yeah.
We have heard. We've been to open mics before. We have heard 1,000 poems read that way. Would you agree with that?
1,000 might be undershotting it.
Very much so. we have all heard that original way of how you read that, right? And I think a lot of times, again, kind of think about your open mic poet. Your open mic poet, let's imagine they might even be in the game for a long time, and there's also a good chance that they might feel that even if their poem might actually be a good poem, they might feel like they're not reaching the success that they want.
Okay.
You game with that, or
like if that's how they read poems?
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about that more, but I feel like a lot of people, even very accomplished
like if like
writers, when they're reading, when they're performing their poems on a stage, they're still reading their poems very similar to how you read that first one.
Yeah.
No,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, a lot of poets, even for instance, having attended, like Cave Canem and stuff like that, like people would read poems like that, and these are, these are programs you have to get accepted into, it's like these are people getting published, these are people who have books out, but they're coming up to the stage and they're performing poems in this way, which is a way that we have heard all levels of poets perform their poems in a way that's, it's not bad, but it's also not standout. It's not something that it's like, oh wow, that reading of that poem, man, that really shook me. You know what I mean? Like it's not, it's missing that grip. And I think so. I was listening to this talk, very unrelated. So there's this guy who he's a magician. He's in Australia. We're talking magic now. His name is Vin Gyang Zhang, and he was talking about a story, and he was talking about how he had been he was a magician for a long time. He even started like making courses and things like that for magic, and he ran into what he felt was kind of this problem where his craft was really good. He had really good magic tricks. People admired his skill, but it wasn't enough, because I think a lot of poets spend so much time, myself included, we spend so much time on craft. We spend so much time on the words themselves that we don't think about the other components that come with conveying those words to an audience ourselves, like off of the page.
I have a theory about that.
Yep.
So okay, so here's my theory. So I think that when it comes to uh, the spoken arts, right? So you have, I mean, like things that are like vocal. You have singing, and you have like rapping, and like singing, rapping, and I don't know. I guess other like country like music. So like when it comes to music, it's like there's like a clearly identifiable thing because like there's a melody, right? And then kind of with rapping is like you have like rhyme, so and you have like the different kind of rhyme schemes or whatever, and I guess that can technically be poems, but you have like a rhyme scheme that you can follow that makes it clearly identifiable. And I think that it's almost kind of like a natural thing that happens where it's like you essentially we have to train ourselves to know that this spoken medium that it doesn't have a melody, there isn't a thing, like we have to figure out, okay, like what is the form of uniformity that we can bake this into so that we can know it's a poem, right? So as opposed to just like talking and speaking. I had an experience a couple years ago at a workshop actually, and the person that was running the workshop, I remember this distinctly because I remember being like kind of like it was funny to me, but it was also like because like the person that was running the workshop, they knew me as well, right? So like we all knew each other, right? But I was in the workshop because I was like, there's no other workshops in town, so I want to go to this workshop, right? Go to the workshop, and the person that's running the workshop, they're kind of giving this prompt, and one of the things that they say for the prompt, there was like, and make sure we're writing poems. This isn't this or like a stand-up set. And I remember thinking like, yeah, because like the way that people think about poems is like you're like, it has to be this thing. It has to be like this. So if you, I mean, no diss to Button, right? But like,
yes, the distant button.
See somebody like come down from this ceiling, like, what did you say?
It's fine.
We'll put a button on you. But no, it's like no diss to Button. But it's like, and I'll say this myself, actually, probably the one poem that I have on Button is a poem that is kind of written. It's like it's a real story. It's a story that's like it's like I know all the people that I mentioned and I talk about in the story, and like that's in the poem, but it's actually written in the way that you would perform a poem on Button, right? It's like, and it's like that's not even something that you necessarily even think about a lot of times when you're initially writing it, because when you're initially writing it, the only thing you're thinking is, I want to write this poem, but you maybe know the things that the poem is for, but because you've probably, and again at the time I had been to hundreds of shows at this point, and seen I don't even know how many open mic artists, and watch a ton of YouTube, and been around other poets, and been to regional and national slams and all this stuff where you see I mean, oh man, if you're in a day of a like at Nats and you have like 4 bouts that you went to that day, you've probably seen a ton of poems that have the same meter, right? And you might have different poems that you're fitting into this substructure. It's different topics, different whatever, all these other things, but you're fitting them into this mold, right? And again, I think it's kind of a way that we systematically kind of train our ear to know that this is a poem. So now we know the thing that we're listening to, this is a poem. It's not just somebody speaking. And yeah, so I mean, I don't know. That's just my theory. I think that, and I think one of the things that I did myself personally, and I appreciate about your work. I appreciate about there's a lot of people's like, and I'm just saying this about like people that I see perform like regularly. I think about like Scott as well. Like Scott's like one of the people that, like I remember being like, yeah, this isn't like a like a Button poem that I'm listening to. You know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, it's just to say that I think that like we kind of, one of the things that I did, and I don't think it was even consciously, it was just like I just remember being like, yeah, like this isn't even how I think. You know what I mean? Like I have to do something different in my brain to think the poem this way. You know what I mean? And once I feel like I stopped doing that, I feel like I didn't really care about that. Then I think that a writing became a lot easier. And it was also I started writing like things that I actually liked, and I think it made it, because of that, it made like how I'm performing them a lot better, because it's like you don't even know that there's like this baked in format, this blah 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 blah. Maybe everybody gasps or they laugh. Maybe you said something that was funny, or typically it starts out funny, right? So they typically have some kind of comedic crash landing into it, so people kind of laugh. You get people in there, and then the next line is a little bit something deeper. This, and then and then you keep going into that, and you go into that, and then maybe the next, or like you keep like kind of delving into maybe some kind of satirical context, and then after that, now you have the people into the poem. Then your next section, you're getting a lot deeper, and then somehow, some way, you are the transformative dynamic in whatever relationship or situation it is. I am the blah blah blah, right? And then they travel down with you, and then maybe like this is like the tail end of the second act of the poem, where now people are excited and they're kind of rooting for it, and now you're getting like the little snaps, like this, and I was this, and they did this, and I can't believe they were doing, and like not because like you're almost speaking from like you're both the first, the omniscient narrator, but then you're also like the first person like resistor of whatever the situation dynamic is. And then the last, the third act of the poem, which isn't really even a climax, because it's like nothing really climaxed. It was like the poem is just like, this is where you're the loudest and you mean the most things and you say the most kind of catchy things that people are able, maybe like these are like your quotables in your poem. They're like blah blah blah. And then that's when I knew blah 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 blah, and then you're done. It's like but it's like a very typical, like, if you get, I kid you not, like if you just go to, again, I mean, it's not just button poetry. Button poetry is just it's a compilation. They've compiled a lot of poems, right? So it's like a lot of places that have a compilation of poems, especially if you're dealing with people that are kind of operating within the same circuit. Maybe you have just like other orgs that kind of run things for like these large circuits. You start getting people knowing how to tell stories in this specific way. They can tell different stories, but they tell stories in this specific format so that people register the poem, and then that's how they know the poem's good, because it fit the thing that I know a poem's supposed to be.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what you're saying too is, so I feel like this kind of like at your typical open mic, you get kind of two approaches. You get the one person who, and bear with me for this, you get the one person who is obsessed with the page, gets the poem the way they want it looking, the super precise word choice and things like that.
Yeah.
And then you get the other person who is also paying attention to the words, but is also paying the level of detail instead seems a lot more focused on the performance itself. And the words are important too, but I think a lot of times there's a little bit more attention to like the acoustics and the rhythm and things like that.
Yeah.
You're focusing on kind of the emotional delivery, the emotional impact of the words in some ways more than the words themselves. But then you're also kind of lacking that first person's attention to every single minute detail on the page.
Yeah.
And I think that each approach is sacrificing an aspect of the poem, in my opinion, because the first person is missing out on that. Because again, when you have a poem, and you're reading a poem, the reality is that, again, people aren't going to be there to, they don't see it. The only thing they have is how you read it. And the reality
Yeah.
is, if we go back to how you read that first time, like, I'm having a hard time in my mind, in the mirror, the real, that's your, imagine your typical open mic poem, and it's like, that's just not, it's missing. It might have all the craft in the world in terms of how you got the words there, but
Yeah.
it's also completely lacking in the ability to convey those words effectively to an audience, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that's like it's a lot of times it's a crutch to lean on, just the page to be like, well, this is kind of it's kind of anecdotal, but maybe it's not anecdotal. Maybe that's the wrong word for it. I'm not even there, whatever. But I think that a lot of times, if there's like multiple open mics in a city, and I'm not making, I don't want to make this like too much about Columbus in specific, because I think I've seen it happen other places. Like, the show that is if a show has really, really great performances, or has like really, really like not even great performances, but if they have kind of louder, more boisterous performances, a lot of times it's like that show is also not the one, doesn't have like really incredible writing. Like, you're not going to be blown away by the writing, but a lot of times it's like a culture thing, right? So it's like you have somebody that goes to an open mic, and maybe before I perform, I go to the open mic, like what a lot of people do. Like, they go to the open mic 3, maybe 4 times before they get up the courage to perform. But by that time, they've already seen kind of people go up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the gap between somebody being a bad writer and a good writer is, I think, much wider than the gap between somebody being a bad performer and a loud performer, right? Or, you know what I mean? Or just picking up certain cues. And it's also because it's like we learn social cues, we learn facial expressions and stuff like that a lot easier, and like we perceive those things, as opposed to just we don't just like in our minds think of great writing by itself, right? There's like other things that contribute to our
We
writing
hear the
skills.
snaz, we hear the
Yeah,
people
yeah,
repeating our words back to us.
yeah.
We hear that.
And then, well, and like I don't say this is bad because it's not bad, but one of the things that happens a lot of times is that people, they start registering the things that get them like snaps and rewinds, or man, oh my god, the rewind.
Please, no more rewinds. Please don't ask.
I know. Well, hold on.
I'm.
It wasn't saying that. It's just
I will say that. Well, you can go on. I'll let you
okay.
finish.
Here's the thing. I think rewinds have I enjoy rewinds, but it's like, it depends on how you use them. You have to know what you're doing with a rewind, but then it's like, I think one of the things that happens when you get a rewind in a poem is that people that are watching you, that maybe they don't really do poems, maybe or maybe that's a bad thing to say. Maybe they are people that just they don't do poems as much, right? And so they see you do a poem, and then they see the rewinds, and they're like, that's how I know people like the thing that I'm saying, right? Is that they're asking me to rewind it, and it's like, a lot of people, they're coveting the time that you're on stage, right? So like now it becomes and I'll say this is even about myself. So like when I first started going to the Nest, so I remember I went to Writer's Block like 3 times, I think, and like the 4th time I was there, somebody there was like, have you been to the Nest yet? And I was just like, what's that? And they were like, oh, you should go to the Nest. And then I went to the Nest. Literally, this was my regimen on a weekly basis. I would, on Monday, I guess it technically started Friday, right? So Friday, I would write a first draft of a new poem. And okay, this is like really embarrassing. Do I want to get? Yeah, I'll get into it.
You're here.
I'll get into it. I'll get into it for you, YouTube. So I would literally write a poem, and the poem had to be 4 pages long. and I want you to hear me clearly when I'm saying this to you, because when I'm saying it had to be 4 pages long, like I have like this like really it had to be even. It's like an even number, and like 6 is too many, and 6 is worse because when you divide it by 2, it's 3, and that's an odd number. So like I wanted it to be like 4 pages long, but when I say probably for 3 weeks of me going to the nest, every poem that I did. No, it's probably more than 3 weeks. It's probably like a month and a half. Yeah, it was a lot. But literally it would be a new like Friday. I would write a 4-page poem, and when I say I'd write a 4-page poem, I don't mean like college ruled this size paper. I had this notebook that was like about this big. It was a pretty good size. Like I don't remember where I got it, but it was like this big of a notebook, and I would literally just write until it was 4 pages. And when I say or write until it's 4 pages, I don't mean 3.5. I don't mean like 3 and 3/4 of the page. Like it had to, the last line of my poem had to be the last line on the fourth and it was like front and back, like not 4 pages, right? But it was like this page, this page, this page, this page,
I did
right?
not notice about you.
Oh man, it was bad. These were the bad
Have
times.
You recovered? Are you still OCD?
It was really rough times. And I want to be clear, these were not good poems, okay? Like, and you can pretty much assume that because they were written in like format 4 pages long, like they were not good poems. They were just like poems that were long. And so yeah, like I would literally every single week, Friday I would start the draft on the poem. Saturday I would be writing the draft. I would be drafting, not really cutting. Cutting is a bad word to use for what I was doing. I was like looking at stuff, and then I would be like, man, as opposed to this, what can I add in instead? Like I would put little act breaks in there, and so later on, it was bad. It was really bad, guys. So yeah. So then so Monday there was an open mic that I would go to. I would go to the open mic, and that's the first time I would perform that poem. And then after that open mic, I would be like, man, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. And I would do some small edits. Tuesday, go to another open mic. I perform there, and I'm like, okay, this is what worked, this is what doesn't work. Now, a lot of people don't know is that so Scott's show, the writer's block was every Wednesday, but every once in a while there'd be like another open mic that happened on Wednesdays too, but it would happen before Scott's show. So I would get, and this was again, I was much younger and yes, stupider. So I would literally get off of work, and the job that I had at this time was really stressful, really long days, and just like I don't know how I did it. So I would get off of work and I would drive directly to this other open mic, and I would perform at that open mic, and then I would go to Scott's show and perform at that open mic. And then on Thursdays I would go to the Nest and I would perform that poem and whatever edits, whatever. And like, I would just be and I like, I was a much worse performer there as well. But then at the end of it, I would just have, just a whole bunch of poems that I just kind of guessed. Did the thing fall over?
It did.
That's fine.
With this camera angle.
We're here, which is all just to say that's a long way of saying that like I had kind of came up with like this regimen for how to create poems. And to be clear, they were very bad, right? Like I can't stress enough how bad they were. But also, I think that one of the things that, again, being a person that's like that, one of the things that could be really unhealthy for somebody is knowing, and because it's like you can kind of sense it from the crowd, kind of when people are like, "Oh, that poem's good. Oh, like that part's good." You can hear them, but nothing I think triggers such an automatic serotonin release of satisfaction as somebody saying rewind to your poem. So much so that there's people that rewind themselves just because. And that I don't that if I don't know if you're listening to me, YouTube universe, listen, okay? If I support rewinds. I support them in moderation. But I actually support them. But if you were at an open mic and somebody has not told you to rewind the poem, don't just, hey, I'm gonna rewind myself. It's uncomfortable for us all. But yeah, no, it's just to say that, like, yeah, like I think that the thing that can be really, I don't want to say detrimental, might be a bit of a stretch, but something that can be kind of bad for a poet that hasn't really figured out their identity as a poet and their writing style and kind of the direction that they wanted to go. It can be really easy to then just write poems to get the rewinds, right? And when I say get the rewinds, I mean you hear somebody say black women are magic, and then, girl, rewind, yeah, girl. Oh my God, man! Just so happens that next month, like next week, the poem that I'm bringing, like, it's Black Girl Magic. It's like, I wonder where you got that idea from. And then like but it's like always stuff like that, right? Or they'll just say kind of like little catchy things that are in the popular conversation that they just add things into the poem that they know that. Man, I went to an open mic and like this guy was doing this poem, and it was odd to me that he was like, he said something like something body like Jonathan Majors, and like he was saying it because it's like, the only thing I can imagine is because like, oh, I know that name. And so you get that automatic like kind of reaction from the crowd, but it was like, it had zero things to do with the poem, like, you know what I mean?
That's a whole other issue.
Yeah, but what no, it's just to say that, like, that idea that people can um can if they get kind of into the mix of like whatever the open mic culture is, because it's, again, it'll definitely vary from, like, it can differ from show to show, let alone from open mic scene to open mic scene, where people are like, this is how I read poems, this is the things that I do when I'm reading poems, and like everything starts to kind of meld and gel together, and now you have like 15 people that all kind of have a lot of the same poems and a lot of the same writing styles. Don't rewind yourself. Is the point of this podcast.
In the case of the magician I mentioned earlier, one of the things that he did was he took acting classes. He took theater classes. And I think there's something that can really apply to poets in general. Probably the last thing you want to do as a poet, if you're like, I want to improve my performance, well, probably the last thing you want to do to improve your performance is actually listen to other poets perform. You probably want to actually get some experience from, listen to orators, listen to people who their job is speaking in public, because I think you learn so much more about just the subtleties. I think a lot of times in the open mic space and the slam community space, there's a lot of missing subtlety and nuance. I think a lot of times you get it's hard to find the poetry slam poem that whispers, that speaks really slowly for a time. Everything is at octave 10. Crank it
everything
up to everything is shouting, everything, and it's everything's often spoken at a very similar pace, but then the slowdowns are often overly dramatic as well, so it's like it's hard to find those middle grounds. And I think those are sorts of nuances that you get more from taking. I have not taken theater classes. I haven't taken improv classes. But
dude, we should go to an improv class together.
We should do an improv class. Let's do it. Greg has, my brother has. But I
knew he was my favorite.
I think that those sorts of I have stories about that. I think that relying too much on the, kind of similar to what you were saying, relying too much on the model is bad. But I also think going back to, I'm going to bring up this poem again, and I think just some, if we just had to give, because I'm not gonna lie, I'm wearing down. I'm a little tired.
Fair enough.
But if we want to leave people with some practical advice for the next time that they want to read their poem, I have some tips.
Yeah.
And
So.
I'll give you a minute to kind of think of your own too.
Okay.
So for work, I'm a pronunciation coach. I help people, with American English, things like that. And one of the things that
Yeah, shout out to Fluent American.
Fluent American,
Yeah,
we out here.
Got the merch. Yeah.
So when you have a sentence, when you're saying something, we don't speak word for word. Like when you're talking, you don't speak one word at a time. You speak in chunks. You group words together.
Yeah.
And so in a sentence, you might have 2 or 3 different groups going on. And usually those little groups are separated by a very minute pause. Not always, but oftentimes they are. So each one of those is those groups of words that are running together in your sentence. Those are called thought groups. And in general, one of the things that really separates American English from other languages is the variety of pitches.
Mm-hmm.
American English has a ton of pitches. In fact, other countries, when they look at Americans, they're like, oh my gosh, these Americans, they're so artificial. They're so fake. They're going so high and they're going so low. Like no one actually talks like this. But the reality is actually we do in American English because that's how we add separation between words. We need the contrast because we have so many reductions. Like I didn't say we have so many. I said we have so many. Like I'm just running everything together. So how does this all come back to poetry? Well, in general, when you're going from one thought group, for instance, to the next, change your pitch. So for instance, to give an example here, if I wanted to separate that very first line into 2 thought groups, like maybe I'll put a thought group after time. So maybe what I can do is I'll start high and then in the second part, I'll go lower. Like I'm having a hard time in my mind. Versus if I just say, I'm having a hard time in my mind, because now I'm just using the same pitch over and over again.
Yeah.
So there's no contrast. So one of the things that you can immediately kind of start thinking about is, okay, where are my pauses? And then maybe I can change my pitch level a little bit whenever I'm switching to my next one.
Okay. I like that.
And what that does is it's also going to make it a little bit more dynamic. Because if I say, I'm having a hard time in my mind in the mirror, the real me is hard to find. That's all the same. But if I say, I'm having a hard time in my mind, in the mirror, the real me is hard to find. Something like that. It's just so much more dynamic.
You kind of have that modulation that's like that's happening. That naturally happens when you're not doing the poet thing. The poem
exactly.
Thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Because if you listen to and this is why I want to go back, because like again, whether you're the page poet or you're the spoken word poet, everyone's kind of got the same problem. Baby. You both have the same problem. In all honesty, it's just one of you's a little louder, and there is more. I don't want to say there's not more performance aspect going on with the spoken word part, but we are still missing a lot of aspects of dynamic speech. I feel.
Well, I think that's I don't want to say it's a lost art. I think that people don't really realize kind of the differences. It's almost like, when people kind of shift, the small tonalities, like tones in their voice when they're around certain people, like down on they did studies, like when like children are around their like fathers, like their tone peaks up just a tad bit, not like but it's almost like from when they were kids, like they knew him since they were kids, right? And they've always had that different dynamic. So it's a subconscious thing. It's not something that happens. It's not something they're doing. It's something that just like happens. And I think that's I think it's something that happens when we're talking about poems, because I'm like, I'd be listening to people do poems, like nobody talks like that. Like nobody's actually really talking like, which is, and it might be even fine to be like, okay, maybe some of the work that I have is not, it's not doing the thing that I'm doing when I'm just talking. But it's like the thing that you're doing when you're talking is like much more interesting than this. So it's like, it's not only much more interesting, but it's like if you're really like if you were, it's weird because if you took somebody's poem where they're very carefully and intricately and sometimes somewhat uncomfortably dragging you through their trauma, it's like the thing that takes some of the sting out of it is because they're also doing the poet thing when they're doing it,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, if they were just themselves taking you through it, you'd probably get cut more because you're like, man, this, I'm just listening to this. I'm just in the space of this drama, as opposed to this is this trauma poem that's happening.
Or you subvert it completely. Like, for you have the really traumatic poem, but you read it in like the super happy, cheerful. I mean, in some ways, that becomes even more traumatizing because it's like, my God, playing that. Yeah, but like, for instance, like if I were to read this like conversation, like if I was talking to you, like, yeah, I'm having a hard time in my mind. You know, in the mirror, real me is hard to find. Like the story, for illusionary symmetry, I must reject deceptive imagery. My eyes can see. You know, even that to me is different than, you know, imagine your page poke going up. I'm having a hard time in my mind, in the mirror. The real me is hard to find, distorted, contorted, illusionary. We've all heard someone read that poem.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, hey, here, pull it back up.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try something. Okay. I'm going to get in the character. I'm having a hard time in my mind. I'm in the mirror. The real me is hard to find. Distorted, like I think
there's so many. Yeah,
there's so many. I think it's like you're actually, you know, the thing that, oh, you know what? You know what? This is new, something that's interesting. Something that I didn't until I started going to actually slams. I didn't really know, because a small amount of, we've gotten enough background on me today, but just a small amount. I didn't really grow up in the poetry community, or even kind of proximal to the poetry community. So when I came into the poetry community, it was like fairly, it was a lot later. So when I first saw somebody do the, you know, they come up to the mic, they look at the mic, and then they kind of step back, and they do this. It's like, that was like the first time I had ever really seen it, until actually, yeah, like that's the first time I ever seen somebody do it in like poems, right? But I went to Fort Hayes, which is it's an art school, it's a arts high school, and people did that all the time for like monologues, right? But monologues are much, I mean, than a lot of poems, are really a lot more interesting to watch, because it's like the monologue is typically taking on the character of somebody that has ticks and, you know, rhythms to the way they speak that are really individualistic from the person that is doing the monologue. And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, I would definitely say it's probably a really important thing. Like that's how I try to look at poems, as opposed to looking at poems like, okay, this is like a poem that I wrote. It's like, this is I have to figure out the feeling that I would feel in what I'm trying to convey, and like let that essentially guide me in it, and not the feeling that I want the audience to feel. And I think that's the thing, because sometimes just like you're trying to decide what you want the audience to feel, and like that's that to me, I think.
Do you feel like that kind of can betray what the poem wants?
It can betray what the poem is, but I think it's like, a lot of times people want the audience to feel the same way about whatever they're doing. So because you want, if somebody's a relative, there's like a lot of like, how do I put them, really grim poets, right? And there's nothing bad about it, but it's like this like really like grim poets who are like, all their work is like, oh my God, like I need like vitamin C after like going through a set. And for them, it's like, you kind of get done with the set maybe, and you're like, I always wanted you to feel bad, right? I always wanted you to leave from this set feeling bad. And because you always wanted them to feel really bad leaving from your set, maybe all of the things that you create, especially if you're creating, like, you know, you have some relative success and you want to keep the ball rolling, it's like, okay, everything that you create, I want you to feel the things that make you come back to me, which is like that, right? But, and you know, I'm not purporting to be like some kind of amazing poet or anything like that. It was just to say that, like, I think the interesting poems to me are like, I'm just watching what this person's feeling. You know, this person, they're not preaching to me. They're not trying to tell me what I'm supposed to feel or how I'm supposed to feel. They're just feeling whatever feeling kind of registers with them. And I'm taking away whatever I want to take away. We read that poem during your workshop. What's the workshop called again?
Fine Print.
Fine Print. If you're in Columbus, you should definitely come to Fine Print. The next one is in April.
Yep.
April, right?
Second Sunday in April.
Sunday in April. So we're reading, but everybody read the poem differently, right? And so like the writer is not necessarily responsible for what you take away. They're only responsible for presenting this is the thing that I feel, right? And I think that's just like a really important thing when it comes to like performance poems, like performing poems. It's like, in order to be true to the work that you're doing, then your goal shouldn't be, I want the audience to feel this way. Like, no, like this is what this poem is doing. And if people listen to the poem and they feel horrible, and then somebody else is walking away from the poem feeling like, you know, enlightened, maybe somebody is walking from the poem feeling like stressed out or anxious or anything like that. It's like, yeah, okay. Yeah. That's what's supposed to happen.
I want to touch on that emotion aspect too. I mean, I think another exercise. I mean, one like acting game.
I thought you were gonna be like, I want to touch on that emotion aspect. Like, what is those? What are emotions?
Like, so I think it can be helpful, like when you have a poem and you know you're going to perform a poem.
Yeah.
Try reading it with different tones. Try reading it, happy. Try reading it sad. Try reading it angry. And that's not to say that when you're actually performing the poem that you're trying to go for all those emotions, but it's just kind of to build that awareness of how emotion affects tone on certain words and things, and then you can try to exaggerate and kind of crank it up. Be like, oh, I think this tone matched what this poem's going after. How can I, even amplify that even further? Because I think a lot of times we get really stuck. We write a poem, we kind of just view it one way, but if we change it, be like, okay, every time I write a poem, I have to read it in a way that sounds happy. I have to read it in a way that sounds angry. I need to read in a way that sounds nervous, and it just kind of keeps you open to perspectives. And also, another thing I was thinking of is one thing that an exercise actors do a lot is, for instance, you may have heard this too. Like, you have a script, but like actors, they can't actually say the words. They can only do like, like they can only like kind of like hum, or they can only make a noise, and they have to convey an emotion using that sound. So you should, if you listen to a conversation, you should be able to pick up, oh, these people are angry, or oh, these people are upset, or one person's happy and one person's not. You should be able to kind of be able to pick up on those different emotional registers.
That's good, man.
So just kind of thinking about that with your poems as well, like just focusing on the sound and the emotions that the sound of your words is conveying.
Yeah. That's actually really, I'm gonna be thinking about that, because it's like, I think the thing that's happening, and if you haven't caught it like yet so far in the conversation, I think that was like almost like the perfect distillation of like the effect of it, right? Because if somebody took the recognizable words away and just made it kind of just the tones that you're saying, like, a lot of times you wouldn't be able to tell what's happening in the poem, right? Because it's like all of your poems are performed.
They would just all sound angry.
They would just all sound angry, or they would sound, like preachy, because like it's like it's a lot of people are writing in a way that's like, they are the ones who knew all along, right? Like that's kind of like a lot of people's poems are like, man, I'm the one who was so forward thinking and understanding of the world that the other, because I'm the subject of my poem. That's the thing. So like, I'm the real subject. Like I might introduce a subject that makes you think that this is what the poem's about, like this person or whatever this poem's about, but the real subject is me, who knew how things are supposed to work or what things are supposed to be. And it's like that is how the poem is conveyed. So it's just like, this person once said blah blah blah, and then everybody laughs because it's like, how could they think that? And I'm like, oh, and this is how I had to explain to them, and you know what I'm saying? It's like, or it's some kind of variation of that, where it's like, and I'm not saying it's like it's not all poems, it's not all poets naturally, but it's just there's a lot of poems that kind of have that kind of temperament, which is just to say that, like, just what you're saying, like, if you know, if you were kind of forced to do that with all your work, like, would you only have one poem? You know, would you be able to layer all of your work if it was like, if there was like a blueprint and your work was a blueprint and you layered it on top of, like, would it all just look like the same exact blueprint, or would you have something like, would you have a structure?
Yeah, I mean, that's the real problem, right? Because the reality is that people are writing 20 different poems, but if you're not really paying attention to the words and you just read it, like just hearing it, you know, kind of casually.
Yeah.
I'll put it this way: if you have 5 different poems, in theory, each of those poems, there should be 5 different ways to be read. You know, we shouldn't necessarily be, you know, falling onto the same patterns over and over again. And obviously that's a generalization of things, but I think that's kind of something to consider. If you're constantly, every single poem, it's kind of like, for instance, you're listening to like a band and like it feels like, oh, that song sounds like their other song, or sounds like their other song. You know, you want differences to be able to separate it. You know, maybe one song is like has a super fast beat and things like that, but then the next one is really slow. It's like, you know, or like one goes heavier on the drums. Like things to be considering too. I think. Go
on. You know. Yeah, it's like something just like popped in my head when you were saying that, because I think that, like, when I don't want to say, okay, I don't want to say this is necessarily the problem, but this actually might be the problem. I might have figured it out. Okay, so, like, especially when you think about the incredibly popular, well circulated poems on the internet, what are they typically from?
Are we going after Button again?
No, I mean, not even necessarily just Button, but it's just like, you know, like, I'm sorry, Button, if you're listening to this and think, like, I'm not attacking you. It's just like you're a really large platform that like, it was just to say, like,
it's low hanging fruit.
Anything, right? It's just any poetry outlet, right? Like, if you're seeing a poem circulate and it's getting, like, you know, thousands of views or what have you, like, what was the poem? What was the poet doing to perform that poem? They're typically slamming. You know what I mean? Like, typically you're getting, because and a lot of because, like, that's that emotion, because, like, the things that you're doing in slam is, like, especially if there's money on the line, is you're trying to invoke this really high level amount of emotion in this 3-minute window of time. So now the thing that happens, and I think it's what happens if anybody figures out something that works and you can replicate it, is in your mind, anybody, like, somebody does a poem and they're like, this is how they were able to get all of that emotion into this window of time, right? Like, this is how they were able to do it. And now you can just replicate that. And now it's like, in order to write and, like, I remember I was like this for a long time. Like, I was like, I need to write slam poems, and the way that you write slam poems maybe isn't the way that you would just write a poem if you're just expressing this idea that you had for this poem, right? So yeah, it's like, you know, okay, and I don't, we can get into slam culture at some other time later in the date, you know. We've all had nothing to lose. but yeah, it's just to say that but yeah, I think that's, like, that could be, like, a part of it, where it's like you have because then it's this thing that extends out into the open mic space now, because now you have these people that are good at slam, that have poems circulated thousands, millions of times on YouTube, and then because now people that are getting into poems, that are just going to open mics, now they're like, oh, let me look up these poems and see what's out there, and then that is the way that they're essentially taught, okay, I want to have a poem that's good. Like, there is this girl like years ago that she came to. It wasn't when the Nest was going, but it was when JG had his birthday show, and she came to the show, and she had this poem that was like a very slammy-esque poem or whatever, and like after, and it wasn't a bad poem, so to speak, but it was like, if you're watching it, especially if you're watching it and you're somebody who's been in the coaching community for like not even forever, just like a good amount of time, and you've maybe seen some things, you've been to some slams, like you might think that this person's been in slams before or something like that, because you're like, this poem was 2 minutes and 54 seconds. It had the dun 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 done, and then stop, and then walk. It had all the markers of like, oh man, this guy there at Russell, like, you know what I mean? And so, or after the open mic, it's like she's like, I've literally never slammed before. I've never, like, this is only my third time on the open mic, but she ingested that. So it's like she didn't even have a thought in her head that that's how long the poems had to be. Like, it wasn't even nobody sat her down and said your poem needs to be within this amount of time or whatever. It was like all the poems that she listened to, that she ingested, that were circulating, were like these 3-minute or less poem, like right around 3-minute poems. And it's like, it just so happens that the things that she creates now just naturally are like, if it's longer than 3 minutes, it's like, it feels like it's probably too long. And I'm just like, man, because I'm not even a person that's like, if your poem is supposed to be 5 minutes long, I don't recommend it. But if your poem is supposed to be 5 minutes long, if that's just what the poem is, and that's what it's supposed to be doing, then it's like, you should let your poem do that. Yeah. And maybe that's not the poem that you take to slam, or maybe a modified version of it, but it's like, there's probably, I personally have seen several poems out there, I'm like, that poem's probably supposed to be that long. Not a lot. Like, don't just like take liberties, but
But it also works the other way too, because it's based on what you see being successful, but then it's also based on what you see not being quote unquote successful as well.
Yeah.
Like, you see this poem, like if you're doing YouTube, this poem only got 100 views. This one got 30,000 views. This one got 100,000. Like, there are these other aspects as well. Although you can also, that's not to say that the lower view video or poem is better quality, because obviously it's missing something, because it's also not connecting either. But
it's, I think whatever the thing that connects in the person's mind, like a lot of it is like, they think they're doing the same thing as whatever's happening on the screen, if they can kind of make these like kind of hard markers. And so, like, yeah, if they've said all the right things in the poem, if they've mentioned, okay, I don't want people to like get like, don't like jump down my throat, but if they mention racism, the patriarchy, blah, you know what I mean, they've said all the right things in their poem so far. So it's like, yeah, you guys are, but like, we've all seen poems that's like it's just, it's a gumbo, right? Actually, no, gumbo's delicious. Actually, gumbo can be delicious. It should be delicious. Not all gumbo is delicious, but a good.
Fortunately, I've never had a bad gumbo. Fortunately,
You've never had a bad gumbo. Don't see now. You said it.
I'm knocking
is this
as
real
hard
wood?
as I can. This is real wood.
Yeah. No. Oh my god. I gotta. The gumbo conversation is not the same. Is not the diversest conversation. So let me not. But there's a gumbo conversation we have to have. But just to say, like, you just kind of have this hodgepodge of like all these concepts that, again, it's because you've seen it successful. You've seen people do this and say this, but the thing that you're not contextualizing is the other things that make, again, which kind of what we talked about earlier, which is the gap between good writing and good performances. The good writer, like a good writer and a bad writer, is much wider than a good performer and a bad performer. But the problem is that if somebody hears that they're not a great performer, I think that that's not as much of an ego hit as somebody being like your writing is not good. Because if somebody says your writing's not good, then that means like I think everybody views themselves as like the savant of poetry.
That's
like
really
not
true.
maybe not everybody, but a good amount of people, they think, I'm this special thing when it comes to but this is also like, we're you everybody has the same story. When did you start writing? Ah, man, when I was 3 or 4 years old. I'm like, okay, I'm not saying when you learned how to write, right? But it's like it's just that, and it's like, okay, I was writing in school. So typically people that are at the open mics, that are performing at the open mics, that are like doing the open mics, like a good amount of times those are also the somewhat more extroverted personalities in their friend group. They're also the ones who typically, if you're doing these open mics, or if you go to a lot of open mics, you're also the person in the friend group that if somebody was just like, oh man, like I want to hear a good poem. Oh, that's the poet of the group. Like also I hate like the friend groups where it's like they're always doing poems, because I'm like, I just want to play like 2K, and they're like, man, let's write poems, guys. I'm like, no. Dang it.
I want to end on just kind of looking at this poem again and other things that kind of jump out to you advice wise. I think another strategy too when you're preparing poems is, I know like when we write, we have in our mind this sort of cadence and the rhythm that we intend when we're writing it. But I think just to kind of subvert those expectations, it can be helpful to kind of switch some things around, like switch some stresses around. Like for instance, maybe you normally would read that first line as like, I'm having a hard time in my mind, but maybe you will stress I'm having a hard time in mine. Or if you could just read it again, I'm having a hard time in my mind. So just kind of, and like working through different lines just to kind of become a little bit more open to different variations.
Yeah.
In experimentation.
Yeah. I know. I definitely agree. I think I do a version of that, but I think it's so I'm not gonna do them, but like I think most of the times when I'm writing poems anymore, I'm not really writing in like my voice, if that makes sense. Like I'm like
For me, it's always like kind of the speaker, like
yeah,
kind of shifting. Yeah.
But that's real. But also, this might be a little bit more concerning. So the voice in my head is like either like Morgan Freeman or it's like Denzel Washington, or I'm developing a Damson Idris impression. That's for later. I'm trying to figure out the poem that goes to, but it's just to say that so I think that one of the things that I do a lot of times when I'm reading poems is, or when I'm creating the work, it's like it doesn't necessarily start off like I'm trying to figure out how to get this thing on the page. It's like this other character is sorting through something, and I think I've character study might be whatever you could maybe think about. In my opinion, it's an in-depth enough character study on the characters of that person to be able to somewhat fairly and well represent the voice of that person in the work. So, which is just to say that like when I'm reading a poem, I'm like thinking in my head, like typically the person is reading isn't the voice that you're hearing. It's like it's well, actually, here, can you pull the poem up?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just give. This is like Morgan Freeman. If Morgan Freeman were to read the poem, I'm having a hard time in my mind. In the mirror, the real me is hard to find. Distorted, contorted, illusionary symmetry. I must reject this deceptive imagery. Like
I would have expected something like, I must reject this deceptive.
What? Wait. I must reject this deceptive.
I would have stressed. I would have gone like I must reject. Like I would have gone higher.
I must reject.
Yeah.
I must reject this deceptive imagery.
Regardless.
John Doe as a helper hand. John Doe as the upper hand. But yeah, so it's just like that. Like and I don't know what everybody else's like internal monologue, like what what's like their process kind of sounds like. But I mean, even the poems that don't end up being impersonations. You know what I mean? They start out not necessarily from my point of view as much as
I mean, I think
some like other characters' point of view.
Isn't every poem kind of a persona poem?
I'm the persona. The persona. Are we all just impersonating ourselves? That'll bake your noodle.
All right, I'm tired, so I'm gonna end our stream here.
I
But
too am tired.
We would love your thoughts on.
Hold on, where's the?
We found it.
We did it. We did it. We would like your thoughts. Oh, yeah. So I have a question. Do you have a question that you want to? I have a question I want to ask him. What's your question?
You go.
I'll do my question.
We actually have, there's a question button actually.
Where's the question button?
What's the question?
Huh?
It says question.
It's
just me saying question.
It's just me saying
question.
Question.
I do it for job, but yeah.
That's like just Jeff. He's like in the board's like a ventriloquist puppet.
Pretty much.
But yeah. So like, what does your internal voice sound like? Is it you? Is it somebody else? Is it a character? Is it like make me not feel like I'm nuts right now, please. Right. Did you have a question, or is that?
No, we're good.
No? Okay, wait. Before we sign off, Diversus Poetry on YouTube.
Yes.
Diversus Poetry on. We gotta do more. That's my job. We'll be doing more with the Instagram. I got logged out on my Instagram on my entire thing, and I lost all of my drafts.
That's super annoying. And did you lose your drafts when you do that?
Yeah, when you log out, you lose all of your drafts. And it was really because it did some kind of update.
Is it still open on your phone or on your desktop?
Wait, it doesn't matter. Like it has to be the app. It like if it's not because you can't even look at your drafts on your laptop.
Are you double check that because they may have changed it because they did change it on. Okay, but anyways.
Well, I mean, maybe you can't. I mean, because it's not like there's not.
But that's unfortunate.
Well, you can't even look at the apps. You can't transition the app. So it's like even if I have because I'm like signed into like a couple other social media accounts that like I'm running for like other like groups and poetry stuff. So it's like if I'm logged in one place and then somebody else is logged into the same social media, like we don't have the same drafts. Like I can make drafts. Like they're not seeing the drafts that I'm creating because like the drafts are saved on your
locally
on your phone on whatever the device is. But which is just to say that I don't know why we that was my fault. That tangent was my fault. We could probably play it back and you could see exactly where I had it. Yeah, well, that's booming.
There's a little bit of delay. There it is.
That's just them like being like, did I like that? No, I didn't. But yeah, no, okay. But yeah, follow us on the Instagram on I think there's a Twitter, right?
Yeah, but don't follow us because we don't use it.
Please
not
don't
yet.
Do that.
we
will in the future. So just like do it now, and then just feel good about it. But then just make sure that you follow us on the social medias, and so that you can be social media caught up. And
all right, again, guys, my name is Jeff.
My name is also Jeff, but you can call me Matthias.
All right, we'll see you guys
for fun.
Take care.